I am joined today by two of MEI's wonderful experts, Senior Fellow Colby Connolly, who works energy issues for us, and Senior Fellow Alex Vatanka, who specializes on Iran. Today's session is on the record. I want to be very clear about that. We are on the record. We're going to begin with just some short remarks from each of us. We'll give you our top lines, the major issues that we see out there, the things that we're tracking. And then we're going to open it up to your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're not familiar with it, if you go to the bottom, you will find a Q&A button between the share button and the show captions button. If you click on that, it will bring up a dialog box. You can ask your questions there, and then we will be taking the questions as we get them in. With that, I'd like to begin, because we don't have all that much time, and this is obviously a very big topic. I'd like to begin with Alex Vatanka. Alex, give us your big thoughts, your main takeaways. It's obviously very, very early right now, but what are you seeing on the Iranian side? What do you think is most important for our participants to understand?
Thanks, Ken. Great to be with you. Look, watching the Iranian reactions, a couple of things jump at me, but for the sake of being brief, the big picture here is increasingly that despite what Washington is saying, we heard what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, that U.S. wasn't involved. The Iranians obviously, at this point, I think, are saying to themselves out loud that U.S. obviously was involved. And that is going to be a factor in terms of how they decide to respond, or perhaps not, although that's unlikely. I think most of us expect some kind of Iranian response. I also have to say, to be entirely honest, I was surprised. I really didn't think something like this would happen before the rounds of talks that were scheduled for Muscat, Oman on Sunday. So, everybody was saying, I shouldn't say everybody, I should stick to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said, we will not do anything until the diplomatic track has run its course. And it hadn't. There were talks scheduled for Sunday, and here we are with Israel doing what it did. To me, that suggests that the anticipation was in Washington and in Jerusalem that nothing was going to come out of those talks in Muscat, and that Iran needed a jolt and needed to be sort of shaken to its core. And that's what these, assassinations and strikes are meant to do. President Trump essentially seems to be playing the good cop here, saying to Iran, look, whenever you're ready, I'm here. I want to cut a deal with you. You know what my red lines are. Obviously, enrichment of uranium should not happen on Iranian soil. And if you don't deal with me, the Israelis have more strikes and operations lined up ready to come after you. How will Iran react? That's the other thing I'm looking at. Again, I use the word shocked. It's really hard to see how the Islamic Republic is so badly infiltrated by not just Mossad, presumably others. Ken, we all remember what happened last summer with Ismail Haniyeh being assassinated in Tehran. Everybody said, oh my God, how can that possibly happen in the capital of the Islamic Republic? Almost a year later, what they did a year ago, the Israelis, they did 5 times more, and probably more. Now we're talking senior members of the Revolutionary Guards having been assassinated, essentially, some of them in their bedrooms. So if I'm Iran, I'm angry, I want to hit back. But again, I go back, how badly am I infiltrated? What are they going to have in terms of Israel backed by the United States to throw at me? And I think that might just delay the response. Again, I suspect there needs to be some kind of Iranian response, but as these hours go on, and we haven't really seen the big guns, if you will, the ballistic missiles, there are these reports of the drones having been fired at Israel. I don't know how much of that is true or not, or if they have gone anywhere, but the ballistic missiles were always meant to be the muscle of the Islamic Republic. They haven't certainly been fired off, and that seems to be a reflection of, as I said, the Iranian regime being shocked to its core, angry, but also worried about multiple factors. And let me just say one final thing, Ken, and I'll stop. One interesting aspect that I picked up watching the Iranians officials sort of reacting to what happened. You have a group of people close to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, people like the Majlis Speaker Baghel Ghalibaf, Ali Larijani, and others, who are sort of talking about the big revenge that will come Israel's way. And then you have folks linked to the presidency, President Pezeshkian and so on, who are much more concerned about reassuring the Iranian public, saying nothing major is going to happen. Everything's under control. And I think they say that clearly not everything is not under control, but they're saying in the hope that you don't end up with segment of a very angry Iranian population deciding, you know what, today is the day for me to go at protest. Today is the day for me to come out and speak against the regime. So the regime does also, beside the fact what to do with Israel in terms of retaliation, has to wrestle with the issue of, can it control its own population, its angry population that this regime has alienated for so long? And I have to be honest, I'm sitting watching Iranian social media, and it seems very clear to me that Israel didn't attack Iran. Israel attacked the Islamic Republic. The Iranian public sentiment isn't where many might have expected, rallying around the flag. It's a really interesting schism that you see in terms of Iran and how it's reacting to what Israel just did to them. Let me stop there, Ken.
That's terrific, Alex. All right, I'll jump in next and talk a little bit about the military dimension to it, and then we'll conclude with Colby to talk about energy markets. So first point on the military situation. This is still a developing operation, and there's so much that we still don't know about it, and we have to recognize that. When I look at what we have seen, what we haven't seen, I've still got some very, very big question marks out there. In particular, it does not seem that Israel has yet struck the Fordo enrichment facility in Iran. To me, that is a very big mystery. That is a very capable site. Iran is fully capable of enriching, making fissile material for nuclear weapons at Fordo alone. The IAEA believes that there is highly enriched uranium stored at Fordo. What I'm getting at here is that, again, this operation is ongoing. As Prime Minister Netanyahu said, it may go on for a while. And I don't think that we yet know its full dimensions. As Alex has pointed out, as we've seen in prior Israeli operations against Iran, Israeli intelligence regarding Iran, its nuclear program, its leadership, its military, is absolutely extraordinary. And tactically, of course, the Israelis are brilliant. I have no doubt that they have a fully developed, very sophisticated plan that may involve a whole variety of different systems, not even all of them kinetic. There are doubtless cyber attacks involved in this. There may also be ground force operations, special forces operations. Fordo, because Israel lacks the air power to take out Fordo, Fordo is a much better target for them to try with special forces. I would have expected them to have tried that right away. They haven't so far. So again, I want to see how this plays out, but I'm watching very carefully to see if these other sites are hit. As I said, right now, it's a real anomaly to me that some of these sites, particularly Fordo, hasn't been attacked yet. Second point, on the Iranian side. First, it is noteworthy that Iran's defenses have been so impotent in the face of these Israeli operations. Part of that, of course, is because of the earlier strikes in October, where the Israelis took down Iran's most sophisticated air defense systems. But clearly, it goes well beyond that. The Israeli aircraft seem to be operating with real impunity over Iranian airspace. And to get to a point that Alex just made, part of the reason that we may not have seen bigger, more potent responses from the Iranians, or efforts from the Iranians, like their ballistic missiles, may be that the Israelis have either drones or manned aircraft in Iranian airspace hunting Iranian ballistic missile launchers, attacking ballistic missile storage sites. All of this is possible. We don't yet have full, complete reporting on any of this. Israel certainly has the capacity to do so. It may simply be that the Iranians are afraid that the Israelis are doing so. And so this may also be hindering part of the Iranian response. But the last point that I wanted to make, and for those who are interested, I put a longer piece on the Foreign Affairs website. You can find it there. You can also pick it up now on the MEI website. My greater concern is the long-term issue. Again, the Israelis are brilliant tactically. My guess is that this operation is going to do a lot of damage to Iran's nuclear program, at least as it exists right now. How much it will set back the program is very hard to say. Again, if the Israelis fail to destroy the Fordow facility, that is going to leave Iran's enrichment capability very much intact and probably won't set, that will mean that the strikes won't have set the Iranians back very much at all. But assuming that the Israelis have plans to deal with all this, assuming that the Israelis really do a tremendous amount of damage to the existing Iranian nuclear program, what it still leaves untouched, the great issue out there is going to be preventing Iran from reconstituting its nuclear program and making a dash for nuclear weapons. The Iranians have in the past threatened to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which is the basis for the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what's known as the Iran nuclear deal. That is the arms control treaty that ultimately prevents Iran from, has Iran agreeing to not seek nuclear weapons. If Iran withdrew from that, it would be a signal that they're planning to develop nuclear weapons. And we should remember, Israel has a track record here of going after other countries' nuclear programs. And the truth is that over the long term, it's quite mixed. In the short term, the Israelis always do a brilliant tactical job. In 1981, they obliterated the Osirak reactor in Tuatha, Iraq. In 2007, they obliterated the Al-Kabar reactor in Syria. Help me, Alex, 2010, was it? The Stuxnet attack against Iran. Each of these were attacks that did, in the short term, really set back the Iraqi, Syrian, and Iranian programs. But what we saw in the case of both Osirak and Stuxnet was that both the Iraqis and the Iranians came back and made an even bigger effort to acquire nuclear weapons afterwards. In the case of Iraq, it was a massive increase in what they were doing beforehand, and we were only saved by Saddam Hussein's foolishness in invading Kuwait in 1990 to prevent us from seeing an Iraqi nuclear weapon in probably 1992 to 1995, somewhere in there. So this is the great question mark, is whatever damage Israel does in the short term, how does Israel and other countries, hopefully the United States as well, how do we prevent Iran from withdrawing from the NPT and doing everything that they can to acquire nuclear weapons, recognizing that most estimates are that it would probably take the Iranians right now maybe a year or so to acquire nuclear weapons. So even if the Israelis can set them back a year or two, are we looking at an Iranian nuclear arsenal 2 or 3 years down the road? Colby, could you jump in and talk to us about the energy situation?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ken. This situation really brings us back to the age-old question of risks to oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz, which, as I mentioned to you earlier, I've really tried to avoid being alarmist about for a very, very long time. And I don't think this is quite the moment where I jump in and say everyone should be completely on the edge of their seat just yet. But it is a situation that should really bring that risk to the forefront again. As you mentioned earlier, this is still ongoing and there's still a lot we don't know. But markets do dislike uncertainty. They dislike elevated risks like this, and that's what we're going to have to sit with until this either gets better or clearly worse. To be clear, right now things in the strait are normal. Vessels are coming and going. There's no sign of any disruption yet, and prices have responded to this risk. They jumped above $70 per barrel yesterday after they'd been kind of in the low 60s for a while, for a lot of the earlier part of June. But they're hovering just below $75 a barrel right now, and that's down from a $78 per barrel high a number of hours ago, which shows that the markets are not seeing the situation as continuously deteriorating. The couple of points that I'll make are that for a long time we've really lived in a world where this kind of old calculus of conflict plus Middle East equals the high oil prices is really no longer applicable, and it hasn't been for some time. And we're seeing some effect of that now. There's a lot of supply growth outside of the region. The Strait is still a very, very critical choke point for oil and gas flows, and will remain so, especially if there is an actual disruption, which there hasn't been yet. But the markets are clearly very spooked by this. The major Asian exchanges all closed down. The Dow opened down 500 points just a little while ago, and gold is up, which typically happens when you see elevated risks like this. It's now up 30% year to date. But the important thing also to bear in mind with some of those equity factors that I mentioned is that this situation is bearish for demand, which doesn't help the Gulf states, to be sure. High prices, are first of all, they're not helpful if you do have an actual supply disruption and your production is shut in. But second of all, this is a geopolitically induced price spike, and no one is really going to make a long-term plan based off of that to either grow supply or take any other form of alternate action. And the second thing to point out, to be clear here, is that outside of the nuclear energy infrastructure, there's no sign yet that Israel has targeted energy infrastructure in Iran. They had signaled, in the past, months and months ago, that might have been a consideration, and it ultimately didn't happen. The thing to remember with attacks on energy infrastructure that feeds into global markets, that is, away from the nuclear program, which feeds domestic power, is that it's not simply a tit for tat situation where, for instance, Israel could go after an Iranian export terminal, and Iran might retaliate by trying to hit an Israeli offshore gas field. These assets are, to one degree or another, linked with global markets. And if Israel were to significantly dent Iran's ability to export crude and other liquids, they'd probably get a phone call from China pretty quickly. And I think that's a consideration for how they're going to move forward. Israel has shut in gas production at the Leviathan field, which is its largest, but even that is not unprecedented. They've done this in the past when there are significant flare-ups like this. No one has successfully been able to target any of Israel's offshore energy infrastructure in the past, and I don't think there's any reason to think that it would be a primary target now, or that anyone's ability to reach it has improved significantly. That doesn't do away with these risks that are going to continue to loom. There's still an enormous amount of the world's energy supply that comes out of the Gulf, and I'd close just by reminding the audience that 80% or so of OPEC plus spare capacity is in the Gulf region. So if for whatever reason, excuse me, an escalation does lead us to the point where maritime shipping through the Strait is seriously constrained, that's a point at which the alternate sources of supply become certainly much fewer. And the ability to get a Saudi Arabia or the UAE or anyone else to raise production is basically going to be immaterial if they can't ship it out of the region. So I think that puts things pretty clearly in perspective for what's at stake. But where we currently stand, it still seems like we have quite a ways to go before we get to the point where there is a direct threat to that kind of energy flow and subsequent threat to both economies in the region and globally on a greater scale.
That's terrific, Colby. All right, please do continue to write in your questions to the Q&A function. We've got, already a really great list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of repackage some of them and pose them to Alex, to Colby, to myself to answer, because again, many of them are touching on similar topics. So Alex, let me start with you. We've got several questions about Israel's strikes against the Iranian leadership. Right. As you know, they've gone after some key, particular military and nuclear related leaders. Unpack that for our audience. How does that look to Iran? What does that do to Iran's command and control? What does that do in terms of Khamenei's thinking and thinking of others? How does that look from the view of the Iranian leadership and maybe the Iranian people as well?
Look, I mean, let me take the last part, Ken, first. Again, reminding everyone, the Islamic Republic has not done itself any favors in terms of creating sympathy in the general Iranian population for its policies, including the fight that this Iranian regime has been committed to against Israel for so long. It's a fight that essentially is regime's fight. It's not a fight that the Iranian people, by and large, with probably a minority of 10, 15% of Iranians supporting the position of the regime against Israel. So it's actually relatively, I can imagine, it's easy for the Iranian people to stand out and watch this fight and hope that whatever happens is going to help the Iranian people come out of it with better sort of quality of life and standards and rights and so on in a best of case scenario. So I just wanted to put out there, and I made that point earlier about looking at the sort of commentary that's coming out of Iran and people making that distinction between these are regime figures that are being killed. Now, I have to also say, as you said, Ken, it's early days. There's been some civilian casualties. If some of these pictures still continue to come out and you see more civilian casualties, that obviously very likely would have an impact. There's that nationalist sentiment that's always there. I'm sure the Israelis have been very careful to sort of make sure that doesn't become a problem for them in terms of what they targeted, how they targeted the individuals or sites that they went after. But to your sort of main point in terms of the leadership, look, the last time something like this happened, January 2020, Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in Baghdad. That was big. This is much bigger. It happened in Tehran in multiple sites involving multiple senior members of the Revolutionary Guards, including the head of the Revolutionary Guards, Hossein Salami. So one has to imagine that there is some kind of a vacuum of sorts at the top leadership. That's what the Iranian leaders think the West, and I include Israel obviously in the West category for this answer, believe is the case, that there's a security vacuum of or power vacuum of sorts at the top, which is why Khamenei has been so quick to appoint successors to those people that have been now killed in these Israeli strikes. I have to assume, when I look at the totality of the Islamic Republic, an entity that was created in 1979, Khamenei was there as a supreme leader. He was with many of these people who were killed are people that he has known throughout the last 46 years. And he's been himself the supreme leader since 1989. He has promoted many of these people. Someone like Bagheri, the Joint Chief of Staff, he was someone close to Khamenei. So there's a personal element here, which might be a factor in terms of what Khamenei decides to do. Is he going to do a Muammar Gaddafi type of, okay, I give up my nuclear program, or is he going to say, you know what, to hell with it? I'd rather die. I'd rather seek martyrdom, go with the others who have gone before me. Remains to be seen. But for now, to a point I made earlier, you have to assume the system is shell-shocked. They don't know, as to your point, Ken, how badly they're infiltrated, how much of Israeli assets are still operating in Iran as we speak, what they can do to stop Iranian retaliation. So there's those facts that come in. But I wanted to just, again, go back to a point I made. The leadership has known one another for so long, going back to 79. There is the personal element here that might be a factor, but we shouldn't forget that there's a second and third generation set of leaders that really have an opportunity here to decide where the country should be going once the dust settles, if you will, because one has to assume a lot of them are not in the business of putting the IRGC uniform on because they want to seek martyrdom, but actually because so far the job had paid dividend for them in terms of the lifestyle and so forth. But now the calculation is changing. So just some thoughts on that issue, Ken.
That's great stuff, Alex. Okay, I'm going to jump in with the next one because we've got close to a dozen questions, which I want to see if I can and bundle up and make some points, piggybacking off of what Alex said beforehand. And that's again about how Israel is thinking about these operations, what other target sets it may go after, and also this question of how the Iranians may respond, as it picking up on some points that Alex made. So first, I fully agree with everything that Alex just said about where the Iranians are right now. And it's very hard to know exactly what the Israelis were thinking. But from my long experience with them and their long experience with Iran, they've tended to see Khamenei as ultimately a pretty prudent decision maker. He doesn't go off half-cocked. He recognizes Iran's limitations. He doesn't get Iran into big fights that they really can't handle. Sometimes he miscalculates, but when he does, he also has a tendency to pull back. I suspect that a big reason that the Israelis haven't gone after the oil facilities, exactly as Colby and Alex both pointed out, is first and foremost because that would represent a major escalation both to Iran and to the United States of America, right? Things that the Israelis probably don't want to do at this point in time. They can hold Iran's oil infrastructure hostage and say to the Iranian leadership, either explicitly or implicitly, if you do XYZ, if you do certain things that we don't want you to do, then we will come after your oil infrastructure. I suspect that there is also an implicit message to the Iranians that another target set like that would be Iran's political leadership. Right? I'm struck by the fact that they have gone after military leaders and nuclear leaders, but they haven't tried to kill Khamenei, and there are plenty of other Iranian senior political leaders, which, given the penetration of the Iranian regime that Alex talked about, they certainly seem like they could go after if they chose to do so. But again, I think in both cases, the Israelis are probably thinking that leaving these two sets of targets intact, Iran's oil production and Iran's political leadership, they can hold those at risk and then use them for what we call intra-conflict negotiations, saying to the Iranians, don't do X, Y, or Z, because then we will go after your oil, we will go after your political leadership. And again, I think part of that is going to be about Iran's retaliation against Israel. I think that's going to be hard to contain for all the reasons that Alex mentioned, at least in terms of deterring them from the Israeli side. Again, I think there are technical problems that the Iranians have in terms of their ability to retaliate against Israel. But I also think a very big issue for the Israelis is that point that I raised earlier. I know from my own conversations with very senior Israelis over the decades, they are acutely aware of this problem that Iran might react to Israeli strikes by withdrawing from the NPT and building nuclear weapons. And one tool that the Israelis would have would be to say to them, if you do that, we'll go after your oil. If you do that, we'll go after your political leadership. So I think that's a big part of it. And then the American piece of it, and to bring Iran back into it as well. I think that Netanyahu is well aware of Donald Trump's red lines. And while Colby, and maybe you want to comment on this, Colby, while Colby will tell you it's not clear whether a massive spike in oil prices would be good or bad for the US economy. It can be good in some ways, obviously terrible in others. It's very clear that Donald Trump doesn't want to run that social science experiment and doesn't want to try to see what happens. And so again, I think that's another reason why the Israelis have tried to stay away from oil on their side. I will also just add to Alex's earlier comments, I don't think that the Iranians, Colby made these points as well, I don't think it likely that the Iranians start going after oil targets themselves right now because of their own vulnerability, both to Israeli retaliation, and if they start making a major, they launch a major campaign against Gulf oil exports, that's the kind of thing that could trigger an American response that could bring in, Western Europe. I mean, heck, the Chinese might even, suddenly go up in arms, pardon the pun, if they see a massive spike in oil prices as a result of an Iranian effort to close the Strait of Hormuz, right? So these are just third rails that the Iranian leadership probably doesn't want to cross right now. And again, I think that they have other options available to them. I think that we'll see them. Alex mentioned the drones and the ballistic missiles. I talked about that too a little bit. Let's not forget that they have cyber tools. Of course, Israel also has cyber weapons. And so far, they seem to have had better ones, but nonetheless, Iran has real cyber capabilities. There's the potential for terrorist attacks down the road. And as I said, the biggest one of all would be Iran simply withdrawing from the NPT and pursuing nuclear weapons. Colby, would you like to jump back in and talk a little bit more about how some of these scenarios could play out down the road in terms of energy markets and what people, what are the key, because we've got at least one question specifically on this. What are the key indicators that you think that the oil markets are going to be looking for? What could set people off? What could panic folks?
Well, I'd start by saying I think, initially any kind of disruption akin to some of the things that we saw in the run-up to Ebcake in 2019, in terms of interference with maritime traffic would be an early warning signal for sure. But I think another angle here, Ken, also is what the U.S. role in this conflict ends up being for however long it may play out. Because if you do want to use Iranian oil exports as leverage, attacking oil facilities isn't necessarily the only way to do that. If the U.S., as we've pointed out many times, we're not anywhere near back at maximum pressure yet. And Iranian oil exports, at least relative to the post JCPOA timeline, are at an all-time high. So their sanctions enforcement could certainly be a way that pressure is added, but again, that's not something Israel can do. That would have to be something that the United States would step in and do somehow, depending on what Washington's involvement ends up being here. So yeah, I think that kind of a disruption would be a key warning for markets, either in the form of sanctions enforcement or potential interference with maritime traffic. I mean, I agree with the point that it's unlikely that Iran would end up attacking Gulf oil installations in any of the GCC countries, because certainly of the warming tides that have taken place there. And I think there's sort of a first mover problem, which is probably not the greatest expression, but I don't think anyone wants to be the first to attack an oil installation and open themselves up to that kind of a retaliation. It's an economic lifeline for all of these countries, and once you start to remove supply, anyone could potentially find themselves in the crosshairs at the next sign of a deterioration. So there are other ways I think that Israel might look at trying to damage Iranian energy assets without potentially upsetting the market, which, as you mentioned, Ken, is obviously a key concern for the Trump administration, and Chinese supply from Iran is a big consideration there as well. Gas assets would be one. Iran has limited export volumes to neighboring countries, but they are extremely dependent on gas that comes out of the South Pars field domestically. So there are certain, I think, kind of domestic choke points that could cause problems there. But again, it's not really moved in that direction as yet. The targets so far have all been military, and Israel's concern is not really Iran's energy industry per se. It's the nuclear sector. So oil and gas has not factored into this just yet. But I still think if you do see some form of Israeli action against even for instance, a domestic Iranian gas assets, that will spook markets in one way or another. I think, outside of those of us that are kind of diving into the granularities of this, the idea that energy infrastructure is attacked will certainly be interpreted as a warning sign.
That's great. Okay, Alex, we got like a whole, I want to put two questions to you, because we've got about a dozen questions from the audience around two different topics, maybe even 24 at this point. One is negotiation, the other is revolution. On the negotiation front, What's your sense, recognizing this is very early on, but what's your sense about the likelihood that the Iranians will continue to negotiate over their nuclear program exactly the way President Trump has called on them to do so? Obviously, this is a big question. As I said, this also gets to that issue of Iranian reconstitution. The best way to prevent the Iranians from reconstituting is to get them back to the negotiating table, get them to do a deal. So that's one set of questions. Unpack that. You touched on a little bit before, but let's unpack that a little bit more. And then the other set of questions is, again, people asking for you to kind of unroll, unpack a bit more your points about Iranian public opinion, where they seem to be. There are a lot of questions around it. And look, it's very clear Prime Minister Netanyahu kind of called on the Iranian people to rise up against the regime. What do you think the prospects are for that? What are the different factors that would be involved in it?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So on negotiations, look, as you pointed out, President Trump wants diplomacy to continue. In fact, I think he said, and Stephen Witkoff had said, they hope that the talks will resume. The sixth round would happen in Muscat in Oman on Sunday. Unlikely that that will happen. But so much of this for the Iranian regime at this point, that as you, again, Ken rightly pointed out, it's really in the business of political survival more than anything else. So for them, the question is, how do you politically survive, come out of this without being entirely humiliated? Because the humiliation, as someone who kind of spends a lot of time in the sort of political cultural context of this, that part is important. How do you, if you're Ali Khamenei, how do you get yourself out of this situation without being entirely humiliated? His predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, when he signed the ceasefire with Saddam Hussein in 1988, he hated that. And he famously said, I drink this cup of poison. But, he had to do it, and he died shortly after. Khamenei has a moment like that, that he has to make a decision. Does he step down, or does he sort of continue? If he wants to step down, the obvious thing to do is to go back to the negotiations, to look for a way to either give up enrichment, temporary for good, or find a compromise somewhere between. I've been making the point that nobody in Iran will be losing their lunch if Iran stopped enriching uranium for a while. It's not a job maker. Nobody really depends on it. Iran could suspend enrichment of uranium, put it away for a while to overcome the very difficult situation it is right now. But you mentioned NPT. One thing the Trump administration could do, I mean, there are two ways you could go about this to sort of compel Iran to come back to the negotiation. You can sort of humiliate them, say, you lost big, we got you, there's nothing you can do, and just admit to it. Very difficult from a guy who's been supreme leader since 1989, who owns everything in terms of strategic files in Iran more than anyone else, who's been overseeing the nuclear program, Iran's ballistic program, Iran's regional activities, more than anyone else in the Islamic Republic for the last 46 years. So you can give him a way out. One thing, going back to NPT, we haven't really heard any condemnations by the part of the Europeans or pretty much most of the world, or certainly in the West. The Iranians are very upset about it. We just got attacked, and nobody's saying a damn thing about it. So again, there are things that US, Europe could do to say, well, what happened shouldn't have happened, something along those lines, to give the Iranians a bit of space to say, okay, we're getting some solidarity, there's some understanding, we shouldn't leave the NPT, because they know full well leaving the NPT has its own major risks associated with it. So in other words, if I could just sort of summarize this, if you can avoid humiliating the man Khamenei, if you think you can remove him and he's likely going to stay in power, then don't humiliate him. Find a way for him to find it easier to come back and negotiate. But if you want to humiliate him, as I said, he might just take the option of martyrdom, if you will, and go where Hassan Nasrallah went before him, as opposed to risking that sort of very public humiliation. Someone who has been going around and claiming to be God's man on earth for 36 years now. In terms of the public opinion in Iran and the idea of revolution, look, all I can tell you, Ken, there's a whole industry about revolution in Iran, as we know. All I can tell you is public opinion in Iran is obviously extremely angry about everything this regime does. Very upset. I have zero doubt, if you had a vote tomorrow in Iran, whether the Islamic Republic should stay in power or go, a vast majority, I would say 80 plus, would vote against this regime. So it's not a popular regime. But that doesn't mean you got the opposition ready at the sidelines to come in and replace it. And that's the problem with the Iranian opposition, has been true, as you know, Ken, for a very long time. There's a lot of energy, anger against the regime for everything it stands for. But that doesn't translate to, having a program, an agenda, the necessary leadership to go in and replace it. And, final point I make, you mentioned something very important. Why didn't Israel go after Fordo? Maybe it's because there's a calculation that Islamic Republic actually can be replaced that easily, that this was the attack on Natanz was the easier thing to do relatively because it's above ground. But to remind the Iranians that if you don't come to a compromise with us now, meaning US-Israel duet, then the next time it might be the United States that enters the fray, and it does have the capacity to go after Fordo, right? So it could be that kind of a calculation that is playing here. I heard what Prime Minister Netanyahu said about the people of Iran being free sooner than they think. He said that before. That I'm not sure the Iranians should dismiss that easily, and yet I struggle to see the types of signs that suggest to me that there is more behind that rhetoric coming from Netanyahu in terms of the revolution just being around the corner.
That's terrific, Alex. All right, I'm going to try to pick up on some points because we've got a lot of questions here, again, about horizontal escalation. That is, other countries being brought into this conflict. So I wanted to deal with a few of them. And, the point that you made, Alex, was one I also wanted to make, which is that the Fordo facility, the fact that it hasn't been struck yet, it's certainly possible that that is about, again, intra-war deterrence. That might be the Israelis leaving that intact to use it as another again, pawn for the Iranians. Well, we can take that out if you don't stop. As I said, I think it's at this point in time something else. It may just be about that the military plans haven't yet unfolded fully, right? But I think you're also right that something out there might be that this is a message to the Iranians that, hey, we're expecting the Americans to come in and they have a much greater capacity to take out Fordo. So I think all of this may well be going on. And again, we just don't know. I will simply go back to the first point that I made, which is that Israel has been studying this problem intensely since the mid-1990s. And I have no doubt, look at what we saw them do against Hezbollah, another issue that they had been studying for years. When the Israelis make it their business to figure out how to attack something, they typically come up with some remarkable solutions. They tend to be integrated. They tend to be across the board. So we may just not have seen what they're going to be up to with Fordo. Back to this issue of horizontal escalation. First point, again, I do not believe that the Iranians have any desire to bring the United States into this war. What we've seen, especially from Khamenei, since he has been supreme leader, is a healthy respect for the military capabilities of the United States of America and a desire to avoid providing the United States with a pretext to use that military power, to provoke us into using that military power against them. I think that the Iranians know, I think they've demonstrated that they know that if they were to, for instance, try to close the Strait of Hormuz, the US would undoubtedly come in with all guns blazing. And while it could be rather sporting, and they might inflict some losses on us, the chances are that we would reopen the strait and do enormous damage to their military very, very quickly, probably in a matter of weeks, perhaps shorter, perhaps longer than that. But again, the outcome is pretty much a certainty there. And there's no particular reason for Iran to want to get into that. As both Alex and Colby pointed out, the US has all kinds of military capabilities that Israel simply doesn't. There's no percentage for the Iranians bringing us in. As for the rest of the region, first point, regional reactions are still trickling in, trickling out. I did note that the Saudis did condemn the Israeli strike. I suspect that privately the Saudis are probably sitting with bags of popcorn in front of their TVs or computer screens, enjoying the fireworks that they're seeing there. Obviously, they take great pleasure in the discomfiture of the Iranian regime. I suspect that that is true for a lot of other regional governments. That said, I don't think any of them want to be dragged into this fray. There's no percentage really for any of them. Israel doesn't need help militarily, certainly from any of these countries. We don't quite know how the Israelis are hitting Iran, whether they're, whose airspace they're violating. They're doubtless violating somebody's airspace, but we don't yet know who it is. Syria seems like the most likely candidate, and probably Iraq after that, but we just don't know. At the end of the day, I think most countries will prefer to kind of, as best they can, turn a blind eye toward all of it. Nobody wants to pick a fight with either the Iranians or the Israelis at this point in time. And then a last point that's worth noting. In the past, before October 7, 2023, if this kind of a thing had happened, and one of the reasons it probably didn't happen before October 7, 2023, is that Iran had a large network, its axis of resistance, that it could call on to retaliate against Israel for this. Right? The great Israeli nightmare was that it would attack Iran and Hezbollah would begin firing thousands of rockets and missiles into Israel in retaliation. Well, at this point in time, the axis of resistance is pretty much flat on its back. Hezbollah has pretty much no capacity to retaliate. Hamas has no real capacity to retaliate. The two groups out there, obviously the Assad regime is no more. The two groups out there that might conceivably retaliate, and I think that there is a pretty good likelihood that they will try to do something, are the Houthis in Yemen and the Hashd-Shabi militias in Iraq. Both of them do have intact capabilities to strike at Israel. Both of them are fierce allies of the Iranians. Both of them are aggressive, belligerent, often mount attacks that the Iranians don't necessarily order themselves. I think there's a high likelihood that we will see responses of some kind from the Houthis and from the Hashd-Shabi militias at some point in time. But to go back to Alex's very first point, I think all of them were shocked by this. And I think they're all going to have to figure out exactly what they're capable of doing, get the rockets and the missiles out onto the launch pad before they can go ahead and start launching. But I fully expect that we are going to see different forms of retaliation against both of them. I don't think either will be terribly meaningful. I do think the Israelis are likely to respond to them at some point in time, but let's recognize right now, Israel's priority is going to be Iran. They've embarked on this big operation, and they're going to prosecute that operation to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion is, knowing that they can go after the Hashd-Shabi and the Houthis whenever they choose to do so, but that those are very much secondary, tertiary priorities for them. All right, Colby, let me bring you back in because, again, we've got an interesting question for you out there in terms of other black swans beyond the Middle East that could have an impact on oil markets generally that could flow into this, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on, in the energy world right now. Ukraine is out there. Obviously, we've got very uncertain trade relations because of the Trump tariffs, but expand the aperture a little bit and talk a little bit about what else is going on globally that could also get brought into the current situation in the region.
Yeah, I think, in terms of the global picture, we're talking about the risk of potential, kinetic action against oil and gas assets, which, as we keep reiterating to this point, hasn't happened yet. And in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that's already been happening for years. And that has at various points in time put constraint on Russia, which is of course second to Saudi Arabia as a cornerstone of OPEC plus. I think the massive kind of supply risk that we have wherever it actually lies right now, though, kind of gets underscored by some of the other factors you mentioned, in terms of trade tensions, which have seen a 50% tariff slapped on aluminum and steel imports into the United States right now, which massively raises costs for things like oil and gas drilling in the United States, and a lot of supply forecasts for U.S. production growth have been revised downward for the year as a result. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve was engaged in some very large scale sales during the Biden administration, and they're not depleted, but they're certainly at very low levels compared to where they used to be. That's in combination with a lot of other inventory levels around the world being lower as well. So the buffer against the type of supply outage that could come from the region, if it does, is not as great as it was, say, for example, in 2019 when the Abqaiq attack took place. Half of Saudi Arabia's capacity was taken offline, and the price reaction was actually very muted because the market had plenty of supply. And there is plenty of supply there now, but the risk will continue to loom large. I mean, I don't think, I think we're actually in fairly strong agreement that the idea of the Strait of Hormuz being closed at this point is pretty fantastical. But I maybe just caveat that a little bit by saying that chaos in the strait could be just as disruptive, other than a full-scale closure, and that's where I think the type of danger, like we saw with some of the tanker attacks in 2019, could start to come into play, and that could be a potentially dangerous point of escalation from there. It's obviously a very fluid situation. The Iranian response, I think, at this point is really going to be critical to determining which direction that goes in. But these risks are going to remain ever present so long as this conflict continues to develop.
Great. All right, Alex, another one for you, and then I'll see if I can jump in with one too. But normalization between Iran, the Arab world. This was something that seemed to be happening, especially before these attacks. How do you think that this changes Iran's calculus with regard? I mean, this also gets this question of horizontal escalation, but even beyond that, how do you think that this changes Iran's calculus with regard to its relations with the Gulf states, with the other Arab states, with its foreign policy toward the Arab world more broadly?
Well, Ken, for the last few years, one of the biggest, hottest issues that is being debated freely across Iranian state-run media and print and so on is the agenda behind Iran's foreign policy. What is it that this foreign policy is seeking to do and achieve? How does it serve Iranian national interest? So, a vast majority, again, I'm not exaggerating this. I invite anybody who speaks Persian who can follow this themselves. Vast majority of the public opinion says that this Iranian foreign policy today, including the position that the regime has on Israel, does not serve Iran. That in fact, Iran could do better in terms of helping the Palestinians by deciding to act on behalf of the Palestinians from a political perspective and not through the likes of axis of resistance and the proxy network that you just described. So this is the reality of Iranian public opinion, and I would say probably a good chunk of the regime outside of two centers of power, the office of the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, who's very committed to this, who describes the fight against Israel as multi-generational. He has repeatedly said, I will not be there the day Israel is defeated, meaning he'll be long gone because it's going to be decades down the road, but that this fight is noble, holy, and should be continued. Now, I made this point earlier. If you're in your 50s or your 40s or younger in the Revolutionary Guards, or someone acting as an official in this Islamic Republic, is this a fight that you think today, 2025, is worth fighting? I really think that's a big question mark. So you have a public opinion that desperately wants the regime to change course on foreign policy because of all the bad things that has come as a result, the sanctions, the tensions, and all the rest of it. So, I mean, if Khamenei wasn't there on the scene today, you could perhaps imagine creative thinking on part of some of the younger ones beneath the top leadership deciding to change course. Because to your point, Ken, when they look at the Arab world, what do they see? They see Arabs who are deciding after decades of trying to fight Israel militarily that that's not going to work. So they've taken the different approaches to it. Iran could do likewise. And I think, in my estimation, if they decided to do that, again, it would help. In this case, this might even help the survival of the Islamic Republic itself. It certainly will help Iranian national interest by preventing a war that could be very damaging to everything that is inside of Iran. And it might actually help the Palestinians better for Iran joining the Arab world in putting pressure, if you will, on Israel on the political front when it comes to the plight of the Palestinians, as opposed to the old story of let's arm Hamas and Hezbollah because that's the way forward, which obviously has brought us to the point where we are right now.
Outstanding. All right. So we've got a number of questions about Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu's motives, etc. I'll try to say some things about that may take us to the end there. And look, none of us knows what is in Bibi Netanyahu's head. And I'm not sure that he would actually tell you if you ever got the chance to ask him. But this is obviously a very big question out there as to exactly why he chose to do what he is doing. I think all of us would hate to believe that a close American ally would launch a military operation like this based on the political calculations, the domestic political calculations of the leader, let alone his legal calculations. But it's been known to happen, right? It's certainly been known to happen. And I think all along, all of us who follow the region, this is one of the big questions that we've had. In fact, I can remember right after the October 7th attacks, I wrote a number of pieces in which I talked about how the war was likely to play out and what the risks of escalation were. And in each of those pieces, I concluded by pointing to the fact that a very big consideration was likely to be how Prime Minister Netanyahu saw his own political circumstances. Right? And there are obviously several different pieces to that. As it already alluded to, the Prime Minister is facing legal challenges. He is on trial for corruption. That is a very real threat both to his political fortunes and his personal freedom. Those loom large for him. Let's also recognize that it was Prime Minister Netanyahu who was in office at the time of the October 7th attacks. Right? One of the worst intelligence failures, one of the worst policy failures in Israeli history. And while the prime minister has tried very hard to distance himself from it and shift the blame onto other parties, I think there was a recognition in his mind that at some point he was going to have to go before the Israeli people to answer for that as well. And that, I'll put it this way, it seems like it would be very hard to imagine that Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't believe that the best defense that he could make against those charges was to be able to say to the Israeli people, look at the great victory that I led you to in the aftermath of that. So whatever happened on October 7th, whatever mistakes were made, whether they were mine or the intelligence communities or the IDF's or someone else's, look what I accomplished afterwards. I destroyed Hamas, I destroyed Hezbollah, I beat up the Houthis, and now I've obliterated the Iranian nuclear program, right? Again, I can't say for certain that this is how Prime Minister Netanyahu thought about this, let alone that this was his primary motive. I can simply say that I think that it seems like a reasonable supposition that an Israeli leader in those circumstances, any leader in those circumstances, would want to be able to go to the Israeli public and say, don't judge me based on what happened on October 7, 2023. Judge me based on the series, this incredible run of great victories that I achieved for you afterwards. And that may well have been a consideration in this. I suspect we'll never know for sure. That takes us to the end of our time here. I want to thank Colby and Alex for joining us. I want to thank all of you for joining us. MEI is going to be doing a second virtual briefing later this afternoon. At 2 o'clock Washington time, we'll do another one of these virtual briefings. At that briefing, we will have my colleague, Senior Fellow Brian Katulis, I think well known to all of you, an expert on a wide variety of issues all across the Middle East. And we will also have Barbara Leaf, Ambassador Barbara Leaf, one of our distinguished diplomatic fellows, who just stepped down a few months ago as the Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. So please join us again at 2 o'clock this afternoon for Brian Katulis, Barbara Leaf, and myself, where we'll tackle these same issues, but perhaps give you a different set of answers and a different set of things to